If a horror film was made all about plants, I could just imagine like this one would just do weird things and it would be the thing that like slowly but surely took down all of the protagonists. I don't know how I feel about this next one. It makes me uncomfortable. Let's kick this video off with potentially the weirdest plant I have ever heard of, the boquila trifoliolata. Now it's really hard to show you the plant in its true form because this is it and so is this. Confusing, right? The boquila trifoliolata attaches itself to a host plant and essentially mimics that plant. It mimics its leaves, the way that it grows, meaning that it can appear very, very differently depending on what other plants are nearby. It can disguise itself as almost anything. And you want to know the weirdest part? And this really blew my mind. If you put it next to a plastic plant, like a fake plant that is not alive in any way, it will also begin to mimic the appearance of that, which I think is just crazy. And it begs the question, can plants therefore see what's around them? Because if they can't see, then how will it know? How will it know how to grow? You know? Oh, food for thought. Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well today. I really enjoyed the last weirdest plants video that I made on my channel, and so I thought today I would do a part 2 to that video. I discovered so many really cool plants that I'd never even heard of before, so today I've come up with a list of 10 more. I'm going to take you through them, we're going to chat a little bit about them. But first, if you're new here, hi, my name's Claire and this is Yoli. I make videos all about houseplant care, sharing tips and tricks I've learned over the years to help keep your plants happy and healthy. And yeah, I've got some really amazing plants to take you through today, so I hope you enjoy it. Let's get into it. So in the same way as I did last time, I've brought my laptop over, I've made some notes on the plants, and I've got all the ones that I'm going to take you through on here. I'll be putting some pictures on the screen from Instagram just there so that you can see them. But like I said in part 1 to this video, I would personally recommend, if you want to kind of have a proper look at these plants, have a look on Google, because they have got so many more images, and some of the things that I wanted to kind of show in more detail aren't on Instagram, just because a lot of these plants are very rare. I can't use a lot of Google images just for copyright reasons. That's the only reason why I'm not putting those pictures in. But if you like the look of one of these plants, that is what I would recommend doing. But the first one is the Ceropegia sandersonii, which is commonly known as the parachute plant. And initially when I heard Ceropegia, I was like, oh, my ears pricked up, because that is the same family as the string of hearts, which is a plant that I think probably most of us will be quite familiar with. But the sandersonii, for me anyway, not so much. And you can totally tell why it's called the parachute plant, because if you look at its blooms, they literally do just look like beautiful little parachutes. And something that I found quite interesting was that Ceropegia, or Ceropegia, I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Ceropegia, is actually derived from 2 Greek words, keros meaning wax and pegi meaning fountain. And that is very, very similar, again, talking about the flowers, very similar to the string of hearts. Like if you look at the blooms on that, although they're not quite as grand as what we see here with the Ceropegia sandersonii, there are similarities between them, so you can see why wax fountain is used to describe them, if that makes sense. Like there's a rigidity about them that is encapsulated quite well by that description, I think. But this one, it looks, by what I've researched, it looks to have very similar care requirements to the string of hearts. However, its foliage is completely different. This is a plant that I haven't actually seen in person. I've only seen pictures of when I've been researching it online. But looking at it, it almost looks kind of Hoya-like. Like its leaves look very waxy and robust and very dark. And interestingly enough, it's also a tendriling plant. Like it's recommended that you grow this plant on a trellis. And just looking at the pictures that I can see from people that have trellised this plant, it looks like they've wound the tendrils in kind of like an anti-clockwise direction, which I know is how Hoyas primarily like to tendril when they do climb. In fact, one thing that I'm always saying is if you do decide to put your Hoyas on a trellis, make sure that you do wind them anti-clockwise, because if you wind them clockwise, you're potentially going to be inhibiting growth. And I wonder if that's the same for this plant. I couldn't find anything to kind of confirm or deny that. So if you do have this plant, please do let me know down in the comments below. And one thing that I saw when I was researching this plant, which is kind of unsurprising, is that this is a plant that's very prone to mealybugs. And I mean, you don't want to assume, but just looking at this plant, that is kind of what I would expect. Partly just for the fact that I compared it to a Hoya. Like, mealybugs, although they can affect pretty much any plant, are typically drawn to kind of waxy, robust, succulent plants. So I would have thought that's one you'd really have to keep an eye on. But in terms of accessibility with this plant, obviously I can only speak for the UK where I am, but I'm pretty sure Grow Tropicals are actually selling this plant. The price I've noted down is about £16, which, to be honest, I don't think is that bad. Like, for a plant that typically you don't see about that much, or I haven't seen about that much, I think that's a fairly good price. I'm not sure if it's one that I would want to rush out and buy personally. I can really appreciate it just looking at the pictures of it. I think it's really cool. I think it's really unusual. I'm not sure. It's not screaming out at me in the same way as some of the others that we'll get to are, but I would never say never. It's definitely very interesting. And so yeah, maybe it's one for the future. I'm trying to picture it without its blooms as well. And I'm like, without its blooms, would it just look like a bit of a boring, generic, like, leafy thing? I don't know. I don't know. But then this next one is one that's been growing massively in popularity recently, and I have seen pop up quite a few times in UK, when I say UK shops, kind of rare boutique online shops, but it is the Microsorum thailandicum, which is commonly known as the blue oil fern. And oh my goodness, it is just stunning. So rarely do I actually look at a plant and go, you know what, that is actually blue, but the iridescence on this one is just, it's just gorgeous. The picture that I'm looking at here, I can just see so many shades of blue within it, and it almost looks like it's been photoshopped. It doesn't quite look real. But this one's native to Southeast Asia, and the one thing that I have read about it, and potentially this does explain why the price is still so high on this plant, is that apparently it's very slow to grow. I think a lot of the time we hear the word fern and we think, oh my goodness, well, assuming it's kept happy, it must grow like a weed. And that's clearly not the case for this one. This one is very, very slow indeed. And yeah, as I say, it is quite expensive to buy. I was doing a little bit of perusing the internet, and I think kind of between 50 and 80 pounds for a very small plant, like kind of like a plug plant size, is pretty standard at the moment. And it's difficult to say whether or not the price is going to drop on that soon. I'm not quite sure how easily this plant is propagated. I don't know the ins and outs of that, but typically when a plant is very slow to grow, you do notice a very gradual kind of slow decline in the price. So I wouldn't have thought, personally, I wouldn't have thought it's one that we're going to be seeing popping up everywhere anytime soon. But that being said, if it's a plant that has a high demand, then obviously growers are going to be kicking in and trying to bring as much of it as possible to the world. So yeah, it is gorgeous. This is definitely one that at some point I would consider adding to my collection. Right now, I'm not willing to pay that kind of money for it. I like it, but I don't think I love it enough to spend that much. But I can imagine it's a very rewarding plant to grow, and it's also very different to anything I currently have in my collection. So yeah, that's one that is on the wish list for the future. Oh, and then this next one I included because quite a few of you commented about this plant after my last Weirdest Plants video, and it is the, I'll try and pronounce this correctly, Decaria madagascariensis. I think I did a very bad job of that. But it's commonly known as the zigzag plant. And the reason that a lot of you came back with this one is because in my last Weird Plants video, I showed the one that's commonly known as the dead stick plant. I believe it's some type of euphorbia. And I was saying, I don't really know how I feel about it. And then some of you were like, if you're interested in the dead stick plant, have a look at this one because there are similarities between the two, as you'll probably see, but it's a bit funkier, and I'm not gonna lie, if I had to get one, I would get this one. And this one's native to Madagascar, as you can probably tell by the name, where it grows in shrubland, so it likes quite dry, quite desert-like conditions, and it's very spiny and prickly, which, as you can kind of tell by the structure, it zigzags out kind of left, right, and centre. It doesn't look like the sort of thing you'd like to walk into, and I still don't think, for me, although I always talk about texture in plants, when it comes to houseplants, it's one that I don't think I would want. I don't think I have any kind of, or I definitely don't right now have any burning desire to add that plant to my collection. Maybe if I had loads of space to kind of appreciate the texture, but I just know that even with some of my cacti and euphorbias, like, they are difficult plants to keep in the sense of when you don't have much space, you just have to brush past them in the wrong way and they will come crashing down. Having something like this, I don't think I'd love it enough for it to be worth the potential chaos. But if you look at pictures of it, again, I don't know if they'll have any on Instagram, but if you do a Google, if you look at pictures of it when it's big and mature, it almost just looks kind of like a big spiky gorse bush. It's very, very bizarre. And supposedly as well, it's very drought tolerant. Like, I've written down extremely drought tolerant and underlined it. So I think this is one that can go for very long periods without water. I think the thing is with plants that aren't, they don't even need to be green, but aren't that vibrant, let's say. I don't know. I just always question the fact whether I would feel if I was actually like getting the sense of growing a healthy plant or if I was just kind of collecting dead twigs. Do you know what I mean though? That's kind of what I felt about the last one, the dead stick plant as well. And I know it's cool and I know it's unusual, but it's probably not the plant for me. And also, again, I couldn't find any currently available in the UK, but in the US, for again, a very small kind of plug plant, you're looking at around about $40 from what I researched. So that's fairly expensive, I would say, for what it is. If you love it, then obviously it's going to make you happy, go for it. But it's not something that I would be prepared to pay for myself. However, this next one, oh my goodness, again, quite a few of these in fact came from you guys commenting other weird plants below my last video. So thank you so much for your suggestions. I feel like I've discovered way more. Likewise, if you've got others that I don't include in this video, please, please, please comment them down below and I will potentially include them in my next video if I make another one. But this one is the Alerium donburnsii. And I just saw this one and I was like, oh my God, I want this plant. It's absolutely gorgeous. You look at it, it's very clearly an aroid. There's actually something about it, I think the arrowhead shape of it, that almost reminds me of Syngonium, although by the looks of it, it's got a very different structure to its growth and it requires slightly different things. But this is a tiny neotropical aroid that's native to the Amazonian lowlands of Ecuador, and it absolutely loves humidity. It's one that apparently doesn't do very well in just kind of standard room humidity, which I never want to say you can tell, but like looking at it, there's a quality about it that I can imagine it's quite a dramatic plant if it doesn't get what it likes. Do you know what I mean? But the initial thing that I thought when I first looked at it, I think because it's got those huge lobes, it reminded me of like, if Mickey Mouse was a plant, this is what I would think of him as. And I know that's a weird thing to say because it actually doesn't look anything like Mickey Mouse, but there's just a cartoony quality about it. And I think the ears probably, that just made me immediately think of that. And it just looks cheeky and it looks fun and it's beautiful and it's so unusual. And yeah, it is just one that I would really like to try growing. It's not the cheapest to buy as well. There are a couple of places in the UK that I found that are currently selling it. Again, in fact, I do believe Grow Tropicals had it in the shop, I think. but you'd be looking at around about £85 for a teeny tiny, very small plant, which is a lot of money. It's a lot of money. And I think right now there's probably plants on my wish list that I would like more. So it is going onto my wish list. I would very much like to acquire this plant at some point, but I don't think the kind of burning desire to do it immediately for me is there. But also it grows from small rhizomes and it's primarily propagated through division. And one thing that I read online, and again, I don't have, apart from the sources that I saw this on, I think there were 2 or 3 in total. I don't have any evidence myself to back this up, but apparently you can propagate it almost in the same way as begonia. Like you can just separate the leaf from the petiole and essentially prop the leaf. Again, if anyone's done this, please do let me know. But I just thought that was quite interesting because typically that is quite unusual for aroid plants and plants like this. I don't know why, I thought that was quite interesting. But yeah, I also love how there's different kind of varieties of it. I'm looking at one here that's got beautiful splashy variegation. I've got one that's solid green, and even that one I think is so pretty. But yeah, it's just a really fun plant and one that I really, really would quite like to acquire at some point. Oh, and then this next one. I don't know how I feel about this next one. It makes me uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable. And it is the Conophytum pagaei. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's commonly known as the lips plant. And you can probably see why, because it's just, oh my God, it's just gross. I know for a fact Ross would love it. He loves the weird and wonderful stuff. I just find it really freaky. But it's native to southern Namibia and it's a small succulent that usually grows in clusters of many bodies forming a small mound. Even that sentence I just find a little bit gross. Like I hate the word clusters, like forming mounds. I just think it's freaky. In my opinion, if a horror film was made all about plants, I can just imagine like weird, this one would just do weird things and it would be the thing that like slowly but surely took down all of the protagonists. But yeah, also in the autumn season with this plant, apparently it can bloom. They typically bloom at night, and I think the blooms come out of the weird mouth-like shapes. I don't actually know, apart from blooming, what the mouth-like things are for. Maybe they are purely to support blooms, I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, their blooms are typically pink, yellow or white, and they apparently are very fragrant as well. Apparently they smell very nice, which is something I was almost a little bit surprised about, because quite often succulents that grow quite close to the ground can have like quite unpleasant smelling blooms. Like there's one, it almost made it onto this list, but it smells like rotting flesh apparently, which is not the sort of thing you'd probably like growing in your house. But yeah, this one just makes me a little bit uncomfortable, but it's kind of cool. It's definitely weird and wonderful. Amazing that something like this just exists in nature. One thing I always find really interesting is how different aspects of nature always kind of reflect each other. Like often, like if I look at the palm of my hand, I'll notice that there are similar markings on the leaves in my plants and the plants that I see out in nature when I'm walking around. There's just lots of things that, like, I don't know, like there was a study done on eyes actually, and how eyes, I can't remember what it was it plants? But yeah, and now these looking like lips, I don't know, I just find it very interesting. But it's not a plant that I would personally choose for myself. But to the person that commented that, thank you so much, because that's maybe one of the weirdest ones on this list today. Oh, but then the next one is an omedrium that I am very interested in. However, I have mixed thoughts on omedrium, but we'll come to that in a moment. But it's the omedrium zipelianum, I think is how you say it. And it's native to Malaysia, and it's a vining climber. And again, if you're able to look up this plant on Google, I would highly recommend it, because you can see what this plant looks like when it's big and mature. Currently, I could only find pictures of it when it was just kind of like one leaf in a pot. And I have never experienced growing this plant. I've only very recently found out about this plant, but I have, however, grown the Emedrium silver before, and the Emedrium silver is absolutely beautiful. There's a lot of similarities to this type of Emedrium as there are the Emedrium silver. However, the one we're looking at is much greener. The Emedrium silver is much more kind of bluey silver. And one thing that I found with the Emedrium is that if they don't have the chance to climb pretty much immediately, they shoot out these runners, and once they start putting out runners, it is so hard to get them to produce foliage. And I had my Emedrium silver for about 1.5 years, and it wasn't a slow growing plant per se. It was always growing, but 99 times out of 100 it was putting out runners. So I chopped it back so many times. I tried propagating the wet sticks. They didn't propagate very well. And eventually I was actually just about to give up, and then it gave me the most beautiful leaf, and I was like, you know what, I'll give it one more go. And on that one more go, the plant very sadly died. So I haven't had the most luck with Emedrium, but I do think this one, I don't know, the structure of its leaves is so long and almost finger-like. There's something very kooky and unusual about this one, and the fact that I can see what it looks like here from the picture I'm looking at, the fact I can see what it looks like when it's big and mature, and there's not loads of runners in that picture, I'm like, maybe it would be easier. I don't know. If any of you have grown this plant, again, let me know. It is one that you're seeing pop up a little bit more nowadays. I want to say Grow Tropicals again. This is in no way sponsored by Grow Tropicals, but I think they have this plant. I believe maybe the Rare Plant Shop as well I saw it in. I've seen this plant about online. I don't think it was that expensive. Again, I think you're looking at around about 20 quid for this plant, which I think is a pretty good price. It's a pretty good price. I mean, comparing it to the Emedrium silver, which is, I mean, very much more accessible nowadays, but maybe not quite as popular because people have had the opportunity to grow it. I think that's a pretty good price, in my opinion. And then this next one, I know I always pronounce this genus incorrectly. I think it's Dischidia, it's meant to be pronounced. I always say Dischidia, but it's Dischidia numillaria, which is commonly known as pangolin kisses or dragon jade. Highly dyslexic. But this one is native to Southeast Asia and Northern Australia, and it's so weird. Like, again, it's one that looking at it, there's just something about it that does make me a little bit uncomfortable. It's not the, I know I said last time about trypophobia, which is when people have like a fear of holes. It's not that, but I guess it's like fear of clusters, and maybe that's why I didn't like the lips succulent as well. There's just something about it that just, I don't know, is a little bit gross. But nonetheless, I can imagine if you've got a big kind of full tumbling pot of it, it could look quite pretty. Again, especially amongst other plants, I think it would stand out nicely. It's also not expensive to buy in the slightest. I was looking online and you can get a nice sized plant for kind of 15, 20 quid where I live, which is, again, I think a very reasonable price. The one thing that I was a little bit confused about though with this one is, so as I say, this is Dischidia numillaria, is I think how it's pronounced. And string of nickels, which is the common name for apparently this plant as well, is one that looks very different. And so I'm like, are there different forms of this plant? Like, am I just looking at one specific form that is quite unusual? And then the string of nickels, is that something within the same genus that's known as the same thing? I'm not sure, but yeah, I did find it interesting that those were both coming up under the same name where they do appear very, very different indeed. So if anyone can answer that question for me, I'd be very grateful. But yeah, just looking at this one's care needs, it seems to be very low maintenance, and in fact it seems to be very similar in its care requirements to some of my other hanging succulents. For example, like the burrow's tail, it likes bright and direct light, it can cope well with some sunlight. I think its sun stresses quite nicely as well. It looks very easy to propagate. So yeah, I think it would probably be a very rewarding plant to own. And again, if you're looking for something quite unusual that isn't that difficult to care for, it's one that I would probably recommend. It's there's just the creepiness about it that I'm not sure if I like. Oh, and if you haven't heard of this plant before, my God, you are in for a treat, because it's potentially, I know I've just said this about another one, but it is one of the weirdest and coolest plants. It is the Selaginella lepidophylla, which is commonly known as the resurrection plant or the rose of Jericho. And I first heard of this plant, I think it was on a David Attenborough show. Like, they showed a clip of how this plant operates in its natural environment, and I was just like, that's insane. So basically, a little bit of background to this plant. It's native to the desert regions of the US and Mexico, and is a species of plant in the spike moss family. And it does have a very mossy look about it. Like, if you were to just see this out and about, even just like, I don't know, walking through the woods in the UK, you almost wouldn't bat an eyelid. It's a very kind of like mossy fern-like plant, but it has this amazing ability to be able to, like I say, some plants are drought tolerant, but this one can go without water, and in fact I do believe without light as well, for years and years and years, and essentially go into hibernation, and it will curl up like a hedgehog, and it will become very brown and very dry, and then you just add a little bit of water to the base of it and it will open, it will become lovely and luscious and green and essentially resurrect. It's in the name. And I know that there are a few types of plants that can do things similar to this, but as far as I know, this is one of the only ones that firstly can do it for this extensive period of time, but secondly can also be grown as a house plant. Like, I've seen quite a lot of people growing this plant in a home environment, and it seems to do very well. The general consensus with growing this plant though is that you don't tend to, and again, I've never grown it, but this is what I've read, you don't tend to grow this plant in the soil. It tends to enjoy just being in a bowl of like some pebbles and water, and you should be very careful not to add too much water, because again, it's a plant that can rot very, very easily. But it's just like magic, isn't it? Like, again, like going back to David Attenborough and how like nature's amazing. I've heard of different frogs and caterpillars and stuff like that that can like freeze solid and essentially die for periods of time and then come back to life as they thaw out. This is kind of the same thing. I just find it absolutely incredible. Like, there's so many tropical plants in my collection that if they were to go without water for a few days longer than need be, then they would dry out and they die. Whereas this one, it can go years. Like, I don't know, that just blows my mind. I just think that's amazing. And I also think it's really pretty. And I think purely for the amazingness of the plant, it is one that I would quite like to add to my collection. I mean, God, if you're an underwaterer, this is like a dream, isn't it? You could not water this plant for months on end, years on end, and it would be fine. But yeah, it's one that I don't know. Like, you know when you hear cool plant things, like the plant I spoke about at the very beginning of this video, and you just kind of have the desire to tell other people and get them to be as amazed as you? This is one of them. Oh, my camera battery just died. Classic. I am so bad at monitoring my camera battery. But we've still got a couple more, and the next one is the Monanthes polyphylla. And this one, I will try and find some pictures if I can on Instagram of it in bloom, because that is what really blew my mind. And this one's native to the Canary Islands. And then another kind of interesting Greek Latin name fact is that Monanthes means one flower in Greek, while polyphylla means multiple leaves. And again, that makes so much sense if you look at the structure of the plant without flowers. In fact, it almost looks like a beautiful green pine cone. It's so stunning. But then the flowers that come out of it are like, they're like something out of Avatar. It really is incredible. And actually, I had the weirdest vision for when I first saw these flowers. I don't know if any of you have watched the bizarre TV show that was on Netflix called The OA. There's a point in that where, I won't give it away for anyone that hasn't watched it, but when they're in the machine and the thing comes out and it goes into their ear, and I think like a seed comes out or something at some point. That is what I thought of when I saw this. I was like it's the same thing. And I just think it looks really weird and alien-y and cool. And weirdly enough, apparently, so this is obviously a succulent, but apparently it grows very, very slowly. And I don't know why. I think probably just because structure-wise, again, it looks quite similar to certain types of crassula, again, like potentially even like the burrow's tail and stuff like that, which are, although succulents are typically a little bit slower growing, they're not the slowest in the world. I was quite surprised that this was incredibly slow, but nonetheless, I think it probably is quite easy to propagate because this is a plant that seems to be quite readily available. I was doing a little bit of Googling and I saw several plants on Etsy that, I can't remember exactly how much they were, I didn't make a note of it, but I don't remember thinking they were ridiculously expensive. So yeah, these flowers that they put out, they appear typically over the growing season, and then I don't know actually the potential of pollinating the plant. I'm guessing you could self-pollinate this plant and get some seeds. I don't know if there are different varieties to this one, but I just think it's a really cool, really unusual, very satisfying to look at plant. As I say, even without the flowers, I think it's very satisfying to look at. And I would say, getting more into succulents. I'm building up more of a succulent collection nowadays. I think the desire for plants that don't require quite as much care has kind of kicked in a little bit, and there's so many unusual succulents that aren't not what you initially maybe think of when you hear succulents. Like my brain still goes, oh, Echeveria and kind of all the standard ones. There's some really exciting, really interesting ones, and so yeah, this is one that I would definitely consider getting at some point. Oh, and then the last one. This one is so bizarre. Its Latin name is Solanum pyracanthum, and it's commonly known as the porcupine tomato or devil's thorn, and you will totally be able to see why. It is covered in these sharp, spiky, kind of bright prickles. And it's strange actually for such a, what looks to be such a light foliagey plant. Again, I haven't actually touched this plant, but typically spikes like that you expect to see on a succulent or cactus, and these are just insane, absolutely insane. Apparently the petioles and the stems of this plant are also incredibly spiky, and they look like they can be quite soft. So if you are thinking of getting this plant, obviously children, pets, be very careful. Oh, and right on cue, children and pets. Hello, baby girl. Hi. Hello, sweetie. Oh, you are such a good girl. Oh no, she's here for cuddles now, so I'll just carry on. But this one is native to tropical Madagascar, and it's very readily available actually for a plant that I hadn't seen. Oh, hello baby. I hadn't seen before. You can get little ones for about £6 here in the UK, and I do believe over the summer months you can grow them outdoors as well. They do recommend bringing them, what are we doing? What are we doing? They do recommend bringing them indoors for the winter months because it's not a plant that copes particularly well with cold. But then obviously you could grow it as a house plant. But it's just very, very, very weird and kooky. And apparently as well can produce beautiful purple flowers, which I haven't been able to find a picture of. If I can find one, I'll pop it on the screen. But it is just really cool, really, really cool. And I would consider getting that plant as well. I'm trying to gradually ease a little bit of colour into my collection without it feeling too jarring or overwhelming. And I like the fact that that's just kind of like dapples of it. So yeah, it is one that I would consider. But again, I feel like I've discovered so many really awesome plants that I otherwise wouldn't have known about through doing research for this video and through you guys commenting them. So as I've already said, if you think of anything that you're like, oh, that's unusual, or I wonder if she's heard of that or anything, please do drop the names down below. I hope to carry on making these videos because I really enjoy them. I almost thought about potentially kind of starting a bit of a community series. I don't know, I'll chat this through with you properly in like a repot and chat or something, but potentially starting a community series where you guys can just send me cool stuff that you think other people should see, and then we can go through it together. Something like that. I don't know. Because yeah, it's fun to learn in this way, and it's fun to just discover new things that otherwise you wouldn't know about. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. And if you have, please make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, have a lovely day, and I will see you in the next video.
Stay sexy, plant lovers.